Hello. In this video, you will learn how to deal as much damage to other monsters as you deal to a dummy. Before we start, I will show you what I used for those damage tests. Jaws pistol, reckless bomber, violent. Recurve crossbow, vulnerability amplifier. Long axe, portable territory. Lone wolf hat, deviation expert talents. Lone wolf mask, point detonation violent. Lone wolf gloves, crit amplifier violent. Lone wolf shoes, covered advance violent. Shaman vulture top, crit DMG enhancement violent. Bastille pants, dead shot violent. Cradles were used for the damage test on the dummy. Handgun enhancement, status enhancement. Tactical combo, first round blast. Lone walker, steady hand. Deviation master, series detonation. Food buffs were used during the damage test on the dummy. Stargrazy pie, whimsical drink. Pan-fried sea bass, pan-fried angelfish. Pistol calibration and accessories were used during the damage test. Rapid shot style calibration with double crit rate. Small compensator. Compact reflex sight. Small infrared indicator. Extended pistol magazine. Tungsten pistol ammo. And lastly, my deviation. Now, let's do a quick recap of the weapons and key armor effect. Jaws pistol. Triggers unstable bomber every 4 shots. Crit hits count as 2. The effect can crit with a plus 25% crit rate and scales with PSI, crit damage, status, and elemental damage. Recurve crossbow. Inflicts bullseye after hitting a weak spot, increasing crit rate by 15% for 10 seconds. Bullseye applies an 8% vulnerability debuff for 12 seconds, making enemies take additional damage. Long axe. Heavy attacks grant Fortress Warfare, a 2-meter area of effect buff that provides heavy armor plus 20% weapon damage and immunity to control effects for 5 seconds. Shaman vulture top. After triggering unstable bomber, it increases crit rate by 35% for 3 seconds. Okay, now you know what I used for my damage tests on the dummy. Let's jump into them. As you can see, each additional buff increases your DPS by around 15%. And finally, the Deviant alone boosts your DPS by around 35%. Okay, so now we know how much damage we can deal to a dummy. The next question is, how can we achieve that against open-world enemies, such as monolith bosses? The answer is very simple. We have to focus on a specific battle stat. Since the dummy is considered a normal enemy, the normal enemy bonus stacking worked well for that. However, for monolith bosses, we need to focus on a different stat, which is the damage bonus to Great Ones. Unfortunately, the damage bonus to Great Ones rolls lower than for normal enemies on gear and weapon mods. You can get up to a 66% damage bonus against normal enemies, but against Great Ones, it's up to 39.6%. So how can we make up for that loss? Cradles. From Cradles, you can get an additional 25% after using a tactical item, and another 25% after summoning Deviant. It works the same for elite enemies. With everything combined, you can deal even more damage against elites and great ones than against the dummy. Okay, so now we know what we need to focus on to deal big damage, but how does it work in real gameplay? Let me show you my gear and cradles first. Other buffs, such as the food buff, will remain the same. Okay, let me show you how it's done in a boss fight. Now I will quickly show you the biggest numbers from today's test. As you can see, we are hitting harder on the bosses than on the dummy by around 15%, which means our DPS potential on bosses is over 300,000. I think I've proven my point that we can deal as much damage to other enemies as we do to a dummy. Now we can talk about further optimizations in terms of gear, mods, food buffs, deviations, and other factors. First off, armor selection. We don't have much room for improvement here since we are using 4 pieces of the Lone Wolf armor set, the Shaman Vulture Top, and we have 1 extra slot. The most important thing now is to select the correct armor set for this extra slot. We have a few options. Bastille, if you want a 10% weapon damage boost when your HP is over 70%. Renegade, if you prefer 15% extra reload speed. Or Stormweaver, for negative 20% stamina cost when rolling. I chose Bastille for the extra damage. Now that we know which armors we're using, the next step is to buy them for the correct armor slots. Since crit builds are among the most flexible, you can plan ahead and choose the right slots so they don't interfere with key effect armors in other builds. I recommend going for the Lone Wolf Hood, Lone Wolf Mask, Shaman Vulture Top, Bastille Pants, or your armor choice, Lone Wolf Gloves, and Lone Wolf Boots. Why is that? I'll explain later in this video when I discuss other builds. Now we can talk about mod choices and stat priorities. Let's start with weapons. We have 3 options here. The first one is a heavy explosives, so-called PvP choice. But this mod staggers all normal enemies and many elites, so if you're struggling to survive, have enough DPS, or just enjoy seeing enemies get staggered, it's a viable option. The second option, Bombardier Souvenir, requires at least 20 bullets in your magazine to be effective, as it refills 2 bullets instead of 1. The third option is a favorite among players since it offers the biggest damage burst, but it loses out in longer fights like against Dr. Mannheim in LEA Research Lab. I recommend using Reckless Bomber for 90% of the game and switching to the other options in specific scenarios. Next, let's talk about helmet mods. Again, we have 3 options. The first is Momentum Up. I don't recommend this mod unless you're doing specific content like Securement Silo EX1 or Forsaken Monolith, because this mod only performs better against enemies immune to elemental damage. The next 2 options are very similar in terms of DPS. The first is Fateful Strike, which is better against enemies without a weak spot, or if it's difficult to hit weak spots 70 to 80% of the time. Another reason to use this mod is if you don't have enough crit rate. I'd suggest using it if your crit rate is below 75% with the Shaman Vulture effect. The last option is Deviation Expert, which I recommend if enemies have easy-to-hit weak spots and you already have over 75% crit rate with it, and if you can stay close to the enemy since this mod reduces your range by 25%. While it makes your normal bullets weaker, it increases your unstable bomber damage and fire rate, which in my tests improved DPS by 10 to 15% on 100% weak spot hits. Less weak spot accuracy narrows the gap between these two mods. For mask mods, we have two options. The first is very situational. If you need extra crit rate, go for Targeted Strike. However, this mod will make your unstable bomber deal less damage compared to the second option, but your normal bullets will hit harder. The second option is Point Detonation, which works all the time, unlike Targeted Strike that requires marked enemies, making it a better overall and easier to use option. For the top mod, use crit damage enhancement with the best rolls you can get, aiming for bonuses to great ones or elites, depending on the fight. For pants, we only have one option, Deadshot. For gloves, we have two options. The first is Crit Boost, which significantly increases your crit chance. I'd only use this mod if you have very good attribute effects or if you don't have enough crit rate. The second option is Crit Amplifier, which increases both crit damage and crit rate. I use this one. For the shoes mod, the best option is Covered Advance. Okay, now that we know which mods to use, we have another question. Violent versus Talents. In normal situations with 7 violent mods, around 55% of your total damage comes from Unstable Bomber. In my testing, switching from Violent to Talent mods didn't change my total DPS, but it widened the gap between the contribution of Unstable Bomber and normal bullet hits. Depending on the deviation you prefer, you might want to focus more on Violent or Talents. I'll talk about this in the Deviation section. My recommendation? Use the mod with better attribute effects, but I don't recommend using a Talent mod over Violent unless it has both element and status damage boosts. In that case, Violent would be better. Personally, I use all Violent mods, since you don't want to focus too much on status damage, as some enemies are immune to it. Now, let's talk about attributes and priorities. Since we are focusing on PvE, you want a damage bonus to enemies on each mod. I'll make a tier list assuming we are fighting bosses, the so-called Great Ones. You can replace this with other monster types depending on your fight. The best mod for me would include crit damage, damage against Great Ones, and weapon damage, with priority given to the damage bonus over weapon damage since the damage bonus boosts unstable bomber damage as well, while weapon damage only affects normal bullet hits. The fourth best option is situational. If you're using the Bombardier Souvenir mod in your weapon, you might want some magazine capacity to increase your bullet count to 20th. If magazine capacity isn't important, the next priority would be damage to normal enemies, as bosses and elites often spawn adds, making it easier to kill them. After that, any reload speed or HP bonuses are nice to have. If you find a talent mod with elemental damage, status damage, and a bonus to enemy damage, I would consider using it over violent mods. That's all about mods. Now we can talk about food buffs that increase our DPS. For the hydration buff, there's only one option to increase DPS, which is Whimsical Drink. For the energy buff, we have a few options. Stargazy Pie, which increases crit damage. It's the most flexible option, working all the time when your energy is full. It's the least conditional option, increasing damage to all enemy types, but it's slightly worse compared to Hot Dog. Mixed Fried Hot Dog, which increases damage towards enemies affected by Bullseye. It offers the highest damage boost, but you have to mark your enemies, which can be challenging at times. I only recommend this in party play, if you don't mind switching weapons frequently, or if you have memetic specialization for scout drones. Bone-in Deviated Sausage, which is the weakest option in terms of damage compared to the others, and it only works against bosses. It's also worth mentioning Crumbly Bread. While it doesn't increase your unstable bomber damage, in fights where enemies are immune to elemental damage, it's the best option. Other food buffs that stack: Pan-Fried Sea Bass, plus 10% fire rate; Pan-Fried Angelfish, plus 5% extra crit damage; Pan-Fried Pompano, plus 5% weak spot damage; Pan-Fried Barracuda, plus 5% PSI. Additional cooking tips. Get a kitchen set with 2 perks to maximize your food effects and make them last longer. Use Chefosaurus Deviant for cooking to get an extra boost to the effects of your dishes. Fish in Broken Delta Lakes for sea bass and angelfish. Fish in Broken Delta Sea for pompano. Fish in Red Sands Sea for barracuda. Now that you know about food buffs, let's move on to deviations. For now, we have only 2 good options that will boost our DPS. First one, Canine Skull, also called Wolf. This deviant auto-attacks enemy targets and draws aggro from you. When a target dies, it spawns a clone and increases weapon damage dealt to the target by 43.2%. Clones despawn after 1 attack. Not much to say about that. Very OP. Its damage is very high too, making this deviant the #1 go-to. Second one is Shattered Maiden. This deviant auto-attacks and inflicts slow and freeze on non-boss enemies in front. It increases their explosion DMG taken by 80%. This deviant might be better than Wolf in some cases, but for now, the AI is so bad that we have to wait for a fix. Other deviants worth mentioning, which don't increase your DPS but make life easier. Mini Wonder absorbs bullets within a certain radius and automatically reloads the current weapon's magazine from reserves. In some cases, very OP, mostly against Rosetta enemies. Festering Gel, everyone's favorite early-game deviant, creates a shelter that blocks attacks and heals nearby allies, restoring 12% HP and 5.9% sanity per second. Worth mentioning is that if you focus more on violent mods, you should stick to Wolf, as you will get a better DPS increase from this deviant. However, if you use a lot of talent mods, you might want to go for Shattered Maiden since she seems to increase final damage by 80%. So, if your unstable bomber does 10k damage, you'll deal 18k on her targets instead. Okay, now we will talk about crit rate and other crit builds, which you can flex with the Lone Wolf armor set. Keep in mind that Unstable Bomber has plus 25% crit rate. Every weapon has a base crit rate. In the Jaws pistol's case, it is 6%. From calibration, we can get up to 16%. The Lone Wolf set gives us 5% crit rate. Gloves mods can give us either 10% or 15%, depending on which one we use. Go for crit boost if you're missing a good calibration. The armor mod. Crit damage enhancement gives 2%. The helmet mod. Fateful Strike gives 10%, which I prefer to use most of the time. Another mod, First Move Advantage, gives 10% for 2 seconds after reloading. The Shaman Vulture Top Key effect gives us 35% crit rate for 3 seconds. At this point, we should have around 80 to 84% crit rate, depending on how good our calibration is, or 85 to 89% if we are using the Crit Boost mod, which is a sweet spot because with the plus 15% crit rate from the crossbow, we will hit around 100%. Other ways to get crit rate. After reloading, we get plus 8% crit rate for 2 seconds from the Lone Wolf set bonus. This is very good since half of our magazine will have an extra 8%. Crossbow gives plus 15% crit rate against marked targets. Long Axe Weapon passive gives up to 24% crit rate for 10 seconds, which is very hard to trigger but worth mentioning. Mask mod. Targeted Strike gives plus 10% crit rate versus marked enemies. Now that we know how to stack as much crit as possible, how do we flex other builds with this armor set in the most efficient way? Since the Jaws pistol build uses the top slot for key gear, Shrapnel with Corrosion uses the helmet slot, and Doombringer uses the boot slot, you should set your armor in a way that prioritizes enhancing the blueprints you don't change between builds, i.e. mask, pants, gloves. For example, you don't want to upgrade the helmet blueprint since there's a high chance you won't use it in another build, which would feel like a waste. Among these three, the best value in enhancing comes from upgrading the mask if you mostly care about PSI, and the best overall value for HP and PSI increase is from upgrading the pants blueprint. That's why I suggest choosing your extra armor piece, for me, Bastille, to be either mask or pants, as you'll want to upgrade those two first. If you didn't know, all legendary armor sets don't share the same blueprint fragments pool, so you'll be able to enhance a few pieces at the same time. Currently, I have managed to enhance my mask to 2 stars, and Bastille Pants to 3 stars using this method. Now, let's talk about some additional PvE tips and tricks that will make your journey easier. Always keep an eye on mutations in hard or pro mode silos and monoliths. Some modifications can boost your damage by over 30%, so take advantage of these when available. Make use of useful whims in the game. The Weaver. When rolling near hostile enemies, this whim leaves a spider web on the ground that chains and slows any nearby enemies. This is a great whim for speedruns or areas like the LEA Research Lab, where you have to fight many enemies at once. Transformation. Cookie. Transforms you into a nearby random object. Transformation ends upon attacking. This is excellent for speedruns, as it allows you to avoid enemies entirely. Living Armor. Activates when HP drops to 20%, restoring 100% HP within 5 seconds. This whim is useful in any situation, helping you survive during tough moments. Make use of tactical items. Improved Scout Drone with the Invisible Hunter Memetic specialization gains the Bullseye effect, increasing its HP and damage by 30% and allowing up to 5 uses. This is highly beneficial because with the Bullseye effect applied by the drone, you don't need to apply it yourself, freeing you to use cradles and mods that work against bullseye targets. Improved Portable MG Turret with the Barrage of Bullets Memetic specialization can trigger the bounce effect, boosting its HP and damage by 30%. The MG turret is now reusable with up to 5 uses, making it a great tool for extra damage and drawing aggro from enemies, making your fights easier. And that's a wrap for today's video. If you have any great tips or tricks for PvE, I'd love to hear them in the comments. And if you've got any questions about the game, don't hesitate to ask. I'll do my best to reply as quickly as possible. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to drop a big like, share your thoughts in the comments, and hit that subscribe button for more awesome content coming your way. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.